Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being distributed, live streamed, and recorded. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please go to the LinkedIn Live video feed, the link to which I've now placed in the chat room. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by making comments and asking questions. To do so, please write in the chat room or turn on your microphone and say hi, and we'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guests are Gino Cattani, Professor of Management and Organizations at New York University, and Simone Ferriani, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Bologna and City University of London. Welcome, Simone. Welcome, Gino.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Simone, I'd like to start with you and then get Gino's to weigh in. How did you become interested in tradition? We normally think about tradition and innovation. You're professors of innovation, but now you're doing this book about tradition. Tell us, what got you interested in that, Simone?
Well, first of all, Simone, thank you again for having us. It's always a pleasure to be part of your show, and it's a great opportunity to share some of our ideas in the realm of innovation. So, concerning my interest for tradition and innovation, I have to admit that the reason was a little bit opportunistic in a way, because I started working and doing research in this topic as a result of a collaborator who at the time was a PhD student who invited me to become an external panel member for her dissertation. And so at that time, I didn't even know what she was working on. She was, of course, familiar with me being the senior professor and with my work, but I wasn't really into her work. And then when I first met her and when basically she defended the dissertation, I realized how fascinating was this area that she had been studying for many years. And it was clearly the world of music and opera house. I'll talk a little bit about it in a moment. But essentially, that was the hook that got me into, this kind of research domain. And moving from there, I then went deeper and deeper into, these dynamics of tradition and innovation in the context of creative industries. But it was really as a result of, her pulling me more than me, for my intellectual curiosity, pushing me into that space.
Fantastic, Gino. We think about tradition and we think about innovation, and innovation simply means breaking tradition, doing something new, right? Do you agree with Simone? What are your thoughts?
I think I agree with Simone, and I think one angle, if you want to study tradition and the interplay between tradition and innovation, is to even focus on the role of craftsmanship. And in some industries, of course, craftsmanship is still a key to success, and that has been, for instance, an ongoing research interest in my case. So the transition to what Simone will talk about in a moment was a natural transition for me. But I got into the topic by given my interest in craftsmanship and the extent to which the tacit knowledge of the craftsman can be transmitted over time, both within the same organization or even across different organizations. That has been the topic of some papers that I published a few years ago, and I will talk about one of them after Simone's presentation.
Fantastic. Simone, take it away.
Okay. So I will share just a few slides that are, I think, quite evocative of the research. So allow me to share the screen. There you go. Okay. Now you should be able to see a picture of Bob Iger, the CEO of Walt Disney. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Okay, so let me see if I can switch. Yeah, excellent. So to kick off this talk, I decided to use the same quote that Simeon used to advertise this show, and it's a quote from the CEO and president of the Walt Disney Company, Bob Iger, where he said, "You can't allow tradition to get in the way of innovation. There's a need to respect the past, but it's a mistake to revere your past." And this is a great quote because basically it goes straight at the heart of the kind of conundrum that we've been trying to unpack with our project, with this project in particular that I'm going to talk about in a sec, but more generally with a series of projects that we've been involved with over the past few years. So why is this a conundrum and that is captured by this quote? Because tradition is, if you think about tradition, is kind of an intangible asset that has a variety of benefits. It is a source of identity. It helps maintain and perpetuate a sense of purpose. It may support competitive advantage because it's unique nature, and also because usually it's very hard to imitate because it's the result of history and the idiosyncrasies of history. And so for all these reasons, if you look at the managerial literature, there are many prescriptions on how to protect it and why to protect it and nurture it and cherish tradition. But that's not the full story, of course, right? As the quote essentially tells us, there is also a downside to tradition. And sometimes tradition may become liabilities to the extent that they can kind of trap firms or organization in rituals and symbols that ultimately inhibit the ability of this organization to change, right? It's a mistake to revere your past. And so the conundrum, it's basically there, right? On the one hand, you have loyal adherence to tradition as something reassuring, but also sooner or later doomed to become anachronistic. And deviation from tradition, on the other hand, is risky. And it can even be sometimes more morally challenging because you feel that you have obligation to a revered past. And so this creates a tension. And as a researcher, we love tension. We love paradoxes or conundrums because they typically fuel our inquisitiveness and our curiosity. And so what is the question that captured the essence of this conundrum? Something like this, right? So if there is this tension, how can they be reconciled, these two forces, these two things? How can the enabling and constraining effects of tradition be reconciled? And it's an important question because in a variety of industries and across a variety of settings, companies sooner or later will have to face this dilemma. Think about musical instruments. Gino, in a moment, will share his work on pianos and violins, but many other industries like fashion industries, in the entertainment world, comics, but also in the manufacturing. There are really many situations where this fundamental question becomes, very vivid and very central. And of course, opera companies, which is the subject of my research, face this kind of tension basically every season. Every season they have to face a dilemma between tradition and innovation. Why? Because when you think about many of our beloved operas in the repertoire, some of those operas are more than 150 years old. Rigoletto, La Bohème, Madame Butterfly, you name it. And it's not unusual for some of the most devoted opera goers to see them again, right? The same opera multiple times. But then there's a problem, right? Making no changes whatsoever to these performances, you run the risk of limiting the cultural relevance of the opera house. And And then eventually opera houses would have to face the risk of becoming museum of the past, as some of the artistic directors that we had the pleasure and the opportunity to interview told us. And so, for instance, you can see here the artistic director of the Pavarotti Opera House in Modena saying, we have been recognized as a stronghold of tradition. If we produce only the same type of opera, we repudiate the fundamental roles that every creative project must have. There is no future without a renewal, right? Or Anna Maria Meo, the former director of the Teatro Regio and current president of Opera Europe, says traditional operas are not museum works. We have to make them live again. So basically, we interviewed many of these protagonists of the opera world, many acclaimed artistic directors. I should probably mention to our collaborator and co-author, the PhD students that I was talking about a moment ago. Her name is Giulia Cancellieri. She worked with us and was actually the driving force behind this research. She's a researcher at the University of Venice at Ca' Foscari. But interestingly enough, she also used to be herself an opera singer and also a musician. And so through her, not only we got exposed to this fascinating world more than ever, but also we had great access to these people. Okay, some of these people she knew personally, and so it was really relatively easy, to make an immersion into this domain and talking to these acclaimed directors about this conundrum, and combining this, as I will stress in a second, also with statistical analysis on hundreds of opera houses. So from this what did we learn from these interviews? Well, essentially we learn many things, but two things in particular. The first thing that we learn is that one of the main approaches through which opera houses try to navigate these tradition innovation tension or challenge is by interpreting traditional work in novel ways through what it's sometimes called as transposition. Transposition are reinterpretation that do not alter the opera in its musical form, but they imply some kind of restaging of traditional material in an effort to actualize it, to renew its meaning. And once again, a quote from an artistic director is kind of emblematic of this idea. For instance, well, let me connect the electricity, otherwise you will lose me. So here you have, for instance, the artistic director of La Fenice, Fortunato Ombrina, who says opera spectators are no longer the spectators of 100 years ago. They live in a contemporary world. So if in the famous title they find a fil rouge connecting the drama with their own sensibility, they appreciate it. The other thing that we kind of learn from these interviews is that this reinterpretation, these efforts can take essentially two stylized forms. There are two ways in which this interpretation typically occur. What we, in our research, we have labeled robust and radical interpretation. Robust interpretation are interpretation that modify more the peripheral elements of an opera, the peripheral features, primarily the visual staging, but preserve the central features of the opera, and namely the music and the dramatic content. On the other hand, radical interpretation are interpretation that modify more profoundly the essence of the operas by manipulating both the peripheral features and the main features, like, for instance, the dramaturgy, or sometimes even the musical score of the operas, in addition to the peripheral ones. Just some visual example. Here you have a Madame Butterfly, what we call a robust interpretation with a visual mechanism of this transposition that is usually spatial or temporal transposition. And here you have Madame Butterfly staged in the chaotic modern days streets of Nagasaki. And here we have a commentary from a famous critic that says the scene opens on the chaotic streets of an evolved East Asian city. The story is modernized, but the direction respects the music and follows the text, the libretto, with precision and in a substantially didactic way. On the other hand, you have a situation where this interpretation is much more extreme, and you have a more profound modification of the libretto, and or the music, as well as the visual modification. In this case, we have Il Serraglio by Mozart that takes place in a yacht, in a harem yacht, with a revisited dramaturgy as well. And again, you can see the difference here in the critique. The connection with the original work is reduced to a minimum. Even the text, despite the adjustment, is often incongruent with respect to what we see. So, what does this boil down to in terms of effect or implication for the survival and the performance of this opera? Are these reinterpretation effective? Well, let me digress a little bit. I need to mention just very briefly two pieces of theory that are important to understand what's happening here when this reinterpretation occur. So this is some research in psychology, particularly the work on research on judgment of values, that provides some clues on what happens. Basically, this research tells us that we, as opera goers, as individuals who go and watch, who enjoy these performances, we develop evaluative expectation based on what? On our schemas. Schemas are in psychology representation of our experiences that guide our evaluation, our perception of reality. So the reaction to a new experience or a new encounter is profoundly shaped by our schema, and in particular by how our schema are consistent, or how the new encounter is congruent with our schema. And you can have a variety of situations depending on the degree of congruity between our schema and what we observe, what we enjoy in this particular case. It can be a fully congruent experience, and when that happens, usually the evaluative response tend to be a little bit boring, okay, or either mildly positive or neutral. On the other hand, when the experience is strongly, disconnected with our schemas or incongruent, to use more appropriate lexicon in the literature, the experience tend to be puzzling because we have hard time understanding or making sense of it. So the sweet spot is the so-called moderate incongruity. Okay? Moderate incongruity is events that are more likely to yield the highest evaluative responses, because they are, on the one hand, they are sufficiently consistent with our schema to enable our understanding, but also novel enough to keep the excitement alive, okay, to make it exciting. So what does this mean in the context of these two interpretation approaches and how effective they are in sustaining the performance of opera houses? Well, basically, to keep a long story short, both the robust and the radical interpretation of traditional material inevitably create some kind of incongruity, because it's a reinterpretation. You are not reproducing as is, your traditional material, but you are changing it to some extent. And that creates this incongruity, this gap between your schema, your schematic ideal, and the object that is being reinterpreted. And then the degree of incongruity determines our response, according to the theory. For a robust interpretation, the incongruity is more moderate, so we would expect a positive reaction. But for radical interpretation, where again you are changing core dramaturgic feature as well as the visual, more peripheral features, and so we are creating a stronger gap, we are making it harder for the observer, in this case the opera goer, to draw analogies between the familiar domain, the traditional opera, and the new thing that they are observing, the interpretive opera. So essentially what this suggests that we should observe different reaction, a positive one for interpretation that have that characteristic, and a negative one for interpretation that should be more puzzling according to the theory. So eventually, to find out, we also ran statistical analysis with approximately over 2,000 operatic performances, looking at the performance of the opera depending on the interpretation strategies followed by these opera houses. And what we found actually was a little bit surprising, because we found that, yes, robust interpretation tends to have a positive effect, increasing attendance by 9%. But at the same time, also radical interpretation, which we were not really expecting to have a positive impact, actually had a positive impact. So does that mean that the theory is wrong? Well, not really. Yes or no. Probably, to be more fair to that, it's probably not. And the reason is that we rerun these analyses, but with a slightly different twist, distinguishing between two types of opera goers. Okay, the first time we run the analysis, we consider all the opera goers together, but then we distinguish them between single ticket holders and seasonal ticket holders. And then an intriguing twist, the result became apparent. Robust interpretation have a positive effect on the attendance of season ticket holders, but a negative one on season ticket holders. On the other hand, for radical interpretation, the opposite holds true, with season ticket holders responding negatively to this strategy, while single ticket holders responding exceptionally well, with an increase in attendance on average of 17%. So, and these are some interpretation offered by our informant on why that happens. That basically speaks to the different degree of openness that single ticket holder and season ticket holders typically have as a result of their more stronger or weaker experience, or familiarity with the operatic world. So, because of this variety, this heterogeneity in the preferences, essentially what we found in our research is that these opera houses face a fundamental trade-off, right? Because the best strategy for leveraging the cherished tradition with one customer segment may not necessarily work with another customer segment, right? And so the key question really becomes, what's the relative importance of one type of segment vis-a-vis the other for your survival, for your performance, even for your revenue stream, right? Is it more about attracting, new customer, or is it about more preserving hardcore opera goers? And because these have different, at least initially, different expectation and different attitude toward the treatment of traditional operatic material, you have to be careful in deciding where to strike this balance between preserving the past or challenging the past with some innovation. So in summary, tradition and innovation in this study really emerged something that has to be blended, can and must be blended. But the key thing is really to identify the right balance. It's not about the balance, it's really about the right balance. And that search for the right balance should be informed by a careful understanding of your market, of your segments. If the priority is on die-hard customer, then if you want to kind of nurture die-hard customer without stifling renewal, then a robust strategy is probably the way to go. But if the priority is slightly different, it's more about appealing to more open, more new customer, then the idea is that introducing more fundamental changes may be the strategy to pursue. So flexibly matching the right interpretation strategy with the right audience is the real key to unleashing the power of tradition without constraining your abilities to innovate and change. So this is, I think, the core, the fundamental message. And of course, we can elaborate a lot on this. There are many nuances, but that's the key message. And I think probably this is a good time for handing it over to Gino to share some of the insights that he has developed as a result of his fascinating work in the world of musical instruments, particularly pianos and violin. So I'm going to interrupt the sharing of my screen now and hand it over to Gino.
Thank you, Simone, and obviously thank you again, Simeon, for inviting us today. I want to be cautious about the time. How much time do I have?
You have as much time as you like.
Okay, so obviously I will not talk forever. I will try to be concise. So Simone just alluded to the tension between innovation and tradition, and that has been also the core of not only of my research with Simone, but also some early work that I conducted in the context of musical instruments, in particular piano and instruments and string instruments. Today I will talk briefly about the piano instruments, in particular the grand concert pianos, because a few years ago I published a paper on the history of Steinway and Sons, the dominant piano maker in the United States, in North America, but one of the dominant players in the world till today. It's a very interesting case for exactly the reasons that Simone was referring to, the tension between innovation and tradition, and how companies like Steinway that have leveraged tradition, in particular craftsmanship, have tried to deal over the years with this tension. The paradox is that when you claim, like in the case of Steinway, that you are sticking to traditions, meaning craft production methods, it becomes increasingly difficult to deviate from those traditional production methods to embrace innovation, meaning standardizing certain production phases of the production of a piano in this particular case. And by the way, this is not only true for companies like Steinway making musical instruments, it's also true for other firms, like, for instance, Ferrari, where you have innovation in certain phases of the production process, but people buy a Ferrari because they know that there is a lot of craftsmanship involved, and that is part of not just the propaganda of the firm, but it's the reality of the firm, where the same people are, the same team of people is actually involved from the beginning until the end. And when you go and buy a Ferrari, the team involved in the production of the Ferrari is waiting for you at the factory and literally gives you and hands over to you the key of the car. So the point is, I'm trying to make is that Steinway over the years has really tried to deal with this tension. And if you look at the early days of Steinway, second half of the 19th century, Steinway was one of the most innovative piano makers in the world. Actually, the grand concert piano, the dominant design, the current, if you wish, product architecture was largely the result of key inventions made by some of the Steinway family members, in particular Theodore Steinway, that is one of the key figures in the piano landscape. He actually was responsible for the introduction of some of the most important technical advancements in defining the architecture, the dominant design of the grand concert piano as we know it today. It has not changed ever since. So innovation eventually was not at the dominant design, the architecture of the instrument, but more at the components of the instrument, different parts. There are hundreds of parts in a piano, so it's a very complex product. The interesting thing is that at some point, when some of the competitors of Steinway were embracing innovation in production processes, standardizing certain phases of the production processes, Steinway resisted that temptation, under the belief that sticking to craft production methods was the best way to differentiate yourself from your competitors. And actually, that was also part of the reason is that virtuoso pianists, if you wish, the most important users of your musical instruments, value the craftsmanship for one simple reason. If you are not mass producing musical instruments, each instrument has a different sound and has unique characteristics that suit nicely the playing style of a particular pianist. So there is a wonderful video on the making of a grand concert piano that literally shows how you can go to one of the stores where Steinway, you can rent a Steinway piano, and there in this video you have virtuoso pianists, very famous pianists performing at the Lincoln Center or Carnegie Hall that try different pianos, grand concert pianos. Each one of them has a distinct, unique sound, and also other characteristics are slightly different. That is the result of using craft production methods. No single piano is the same as other pianos produced by the same company. That is something that grand concert virtuoso pianists valued from the very beginning. So Steinway decided to stick to craft production methods also because the main users the virtuoso pianists really value that the way Steinway was making pianos. And the reason why I'm insisting on this is that other buyers follow the lead of virtuoso pianists. If you have to make a significant investment to buy a grand concert piano, you would rather buy a piano that virtuoso pianists typically play. So these are the status-driven buyers, and that was very well understood by Steinway. So the paradox here is that you are becoming highly distinctive, very differentiated, but by sticking to tradition, you also face a lot of constraints. So your degrees of freedom are significantly reduced because you cannot embrace any kind of innovation. You have to embrace innovation that does not affect the perception that you are still sticking to traditional production methods, in this case, craft production methods. So this creates opportunities, as I said, higher perceived value, more willingness to pay, but also reduces your degrees of freedom in the sense that you are facing constraints that other firms do not face. An interesting counterexample, for instance, is a company like Yamaha that historically has been known for being a mass producers of all kinds of musical instruments that at a certain point in its history tried to develop a separate unit based on craft production methods to make piano. And although the pianos are high quality and some virtuoso performers even think that are as good as a Steinway or a Bosendorfer or Bechstein, other craft piano producers, the vast majority still perceives Yamaha as a mass producer, which means that even though the instruments are probably as good as the Steinway, they are not part of that elite group. So the reason why I'm making the example of Yamaha is to emphasize the fact that in order to develop a strong identity for being a craft producer, your history has to show that you were always a craft producer. You cannot just invent yourself or reinvent yourself at a particular point in time and say, I'm a craft producer when you were a mass producer until yesterday, correct? So again, the case of Steinway is interesting because, like other companies, I was mentioning Ferrari, for instance, in a completely different context, but you can think about luxury Swiss watchmakers, for instance. They have developed over the years this unique identity as craft producers, and they have adhered to craft production methods, resistance historically the temptation of embracing innovation that would have reduced their cost, but drastically reduced the perceived value, the unique value in the eyes of some of the most important buyers, as in the case of Steinway, obviously the virtuoso performers and other status-driven buyers. So the study shows that when we think about resource tradition from a strategic standpoint, the question to ask is a tradition a resource, something that you can leverage to obviously make money at the end of the day, or is a constraint? And in other words, you are limited in the strategic choices that you have because you can only make certain choices. And I think that this is also the tension that the opera houses are facing. To what extent we can deviate from tradition, to what extent we can innovate in a robust kind of middle ground type of innovation or radical way. So Steinway has always faced this kind of tension. And actually when in 1972, for instance, the company was sold to CBS, like a conglomerate, a media company that tried to reduce cost because CBS, like many large firms, was applying a strict financial logic, reducing cost, increased profits, laying off sometimes even skilled, highly paid craftsmen. Then the perception was that the Steinway was not the same as before, That's why eventually CBS, before selling the company to another company, switched back to craft production methods. So these are the tensions that firms operating in this space face. And I think that, for instance, in the case of Steinway, for most of its history, Steinway was a family-run business. Having a family in charge of the company, being involved with management of the company is very important. I think that if you look at most of the firms that are still closely adhering to traditions, they tend to be family-run businesses, because if a family is a well-known fact that when firms are run by families, the social emotional wealth prevails over a strict financial logic that sometimes, unfortunately, drives the strategic decisions of firms that are not family-driven, that are more driven by the stock exchange logic than this social emotional wealth, where sometimes you leave profits on the table just to make the best possible instrument, or by paying more some of your skilled craftsmen, but those are the people that you need to retain in order to make pianos in a particular way and of a particular quality. So I think that this tension is really central in these for some of these firms, and I mean, I would be happy to address any question if there is any question, but again, this is a very important topic in strategy, because we observe more and more firms nowadays claiming authenticity, for instance, in the way they produce certain things, but some of these firms don't have the long history as a pedigree to really support the authenticity of those claims. Yeah.
Okay, so are there any questions? Does any we have a lot of information here. Feel free to chime in. Hi.
Yeah, hi. So I had this has inspired a thought. So we live in central Massachusetts in Concord, a very traditional town. An adjacent town is Lincoln, similarly traditional. And the example that this makes me think of is this Walter Gropius, who was one of the founders of the Bauhaus School of Architecture, a very, very innovative approach to architecture, came to the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And he was given a piece of land to build a house in Lincoln, which is a very traditional town. And his solution is now known as the Gropius House, which is a blend of modern architecture and traditional New England materials and vocabulary. And I think it's tremendously successful as an example of an innovative approach to architecture that blends in the tradition of the town and the tradition of New England. And you can visit it. Actually, the Boston Architectural Center runs tours, but it's very much available online. So it's a totally innovative design, no doubt about that, but it uses all traditional materials.
Fantastic. Gino, Simone, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I can start quickly. I mean, because I live in the United States, and sometimes I like to go to Massachusetts or New England, because it's a very interesting context to see some of this blending. Correct? I mean, I think I think that some the things that we are talking about and are kind of consistent with that idea. Correct? I mean, you can still have, like Simone was standing before, robust interpretations of traditional operas, even without necessarily looking at a radical interpretation of traditional operas. And some of them are enormously successful. It's actually breathing new life into a relic of the past, as some would say. I think that in the context of pianos, it's very difficult to make significant innovation, because, as I said, if you look at most of the musical instruments, the dominant design is defined, is crystallized, right? It's not changing. Where you can make some innovative contribution is at the components level, correct? Maybe the material that you use. You can incorporate maybe some of the latest advancements in acoustics to further improve the sound of an instrument by changing the material with which some of the components are made. I mean, I have a new project on electric guitars, and again, the instrument, the dominant design is defined, but you observe still a lot of innovation around the materials, incorporating new advancements in science. I mean, even Theodore Steinway, for instance, was very careful about preserving the craftsmanship of the production methods, but he was very sensitive to any advancement in science, in metallurgy, for instance, to make the iron parts of the piano. He actually was the first to introduce on a Steinway metallic components, but also incorporating advancement in acoustics and other materials with which a piano is made, correct? So, and also, for instance, the science of wood, how you choose the right wood to make a piano. So I think that is kind of similar in spirit to what you were suggesting, where you have new advancements, scientific advancements incorporated into a seemingly traditional piano. Yeah. Simone, you want to say something? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Now can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Yes, I think it's a great point. It's a great exemplar. Architecture is a fantastic, it's one of the fantastic kind of industries where you can really see very visibly that sometimes these efforts, this attempt to create, as you call it, a blend between tradition and innovation can work spectacularly well. Sometimes they don't. But when they do, the results can be nothing short of astonishing. And so I very briefly at the beginning, perhaps we weren't yet live, but I mentioned that we are organizing at the end of this year in mid-December a conference on traditional innovation, which will take place in a very special place. It's an Italian city called Matera in southern Italy. Well, Matera, just like, the case that you share with us, is an incredible, it's fantastic example of how tradition and innovation can be architecturally fused together to create something truly unique. Now, Matera is a small town. It's I don't know how many inhabitants, but we're really talking of a relatively small city. But it's well known to urban planners as one of the most dramatic cases of rebirth. And the reason is because Matera this is a town that is the result of layers and layers of stratification, historical stratification, from Neolithical settlements to middle-aged Benedictine monasteries to a maze of underground and overground caves, which have been created over the years. And unfortunately, back in the 40s and in the 60s of the 20th century, these caves were very poorly maintained, were almost collapsing, and people lived inside, but they lived in very extreme condition of poverty. Most of these people lived in in condition of under the threshold of poverty. And so what happened in the late 60s, the Italian government organized kind of an open call for projects from architectural projects from architects to find ways to reinvent this history in a more compelling visually, but also from a sanitary point of view, decent manner. And so as a result of all these projects coming in, some of the best top architects in Italy, the city was completely, especially all these maze of caves were repurposed in the mid 70s, probably late 70s. They were repurposed by some of the best architects, and these caves were transformed into beautiful houses, and the city was renamed the City of Stone as a result of this structural intervention. And as a result of that, it was eventually in 79 declared UNESCO World Heritage Site. So this is really, exactly, it speaks precisely to to your example of this effort through, art and architecture to find ways to, bring together the best of both worlds, of the tradition with all these nuances, but also the innovation. They need to, recast the city in the future, to reinvent the city in the future, but without losing touch with these very profound roots. And so if you haven't been to Matera, I think one of those places where you should definitely go. It's a breathtaking view. You can kind of glimpse at it when you look at The Passion of Christ by Mel Gibson, because that's where the movie was was staged and shot. But this is precisely this is the result of this very, deliberate attempt, which in this case was very successful.
By the way, if I want to just add one thing briefly to what Simone was saying. So one thing, and going back to the question, one thing is to think about repurposing what is already existing and maybe blend together modern and in the past with modern architecture. Correct? I'm actually talking from Kyoto in Japan. I'm actually in Japan right now. And Kyoto is actually quite an interesting town in a different way from Matera, in the sense that you don't have necessarily old buildings that have been repurposed. You have old buildings next to modern buildings, correct? It's an incredible blending, if you wish, between modern things and old things. And I think that is perfectly fine, correct? I mean, you can preserve the old and basically develop the new in a way that is compatible, correct? I mean, fortunately, in some other places, the modern and the old don't really go hand in hand, correct? But I mean, we can think about repurposing the old, but also building the new next to the old in a way that is kind of creates like a seamless, if you wish, experience where eventually the two are not conflicting but are complementing each other. So Kyoto, in my opinion, is an incredible experience in that, incredible example of how you can achieve that goal. Yeah.
Fantastic, Gino. So last question, what excites you most about tradition?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think being myself Italian, of course, and being born in a very old town, tradition is part of my DNA. So so it's not speaking about tradition for me is speaking about myself in many ways. So there is an existential component to it. On the other hand, I broke from tradition because I left my hometown to migrate to the United States at some point in my life because probably I was feeling the pressure of tradition but the negative part of tradition. But trying to be a little bit more not to be too personal, I think that the beauty of speaking about and doing research, I would say, on tradition is that you really have to grapple with this fundamental tension that I think is critical, especially if you teach strategy or organizational theory, as I do. Basically, the tension between being still free to innovate, but also being constrained by your tradition, and how you manage this tension. To what extent I can stray off tradition as opposed to sticking to tradition, and under which condition one or the other seems to be the most viable way to go from a strategic standpoint. Of course, there are other reasons, but this is, I think, is one of the excitement of doing research in this space. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's see how we can stay in touch. Oh, but first of all, I'd like to point out to everybody, that their book on tradition and innovation will be coming out in the spring by Emerald, published by Emerald Insight. That's emerald.com. So I believe you put in here Cattani, for instance, then you'll have some of their publications that come up. Is that right? There it is. Gino Cattani, novelty,
yes,
forcing and sustaining it. So we have already some publications by Emerald Insight that you can find by Simone and Gino. And when will it be coming out, Gino?
I think that depends also on the publisher, but I think realistically, I think it would be at the end of 2024, maybe January 2025, depending on the publisher's backlog. But that is the date that we are aiming to, and hopefully by early 2025, the book will be out. Will be an edited book, meaning that there will be contributions from different people, because we really want to have a lot of variety in terms of contributors, perspectives, context. So we have an international, highly international composition of contributors. So I'm sure that the book will be appealing to different people for different reasons.
Fantastic.
There is, let me emphasize how this is the topic that is actually gaining a lot of traction in strategy and organizational theory. So I think it's the right moment to have an edited book on this topic, because there is growing interest in the role of tradition and the interplay between innovation and tradition.
Lucky we are to have you today, Gino and Simone.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
See how we can stay in touch. Gino can be reached here at stern.nyu.edu. So people can reach out to you if they have any questions at that email. Is that right?
Absolutely. And of course, I try to update my website with the latest publication, my latest CV, but please feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. I can share my work, past work or more recent work by sending papers or a copy of the book chapters that I wrote over the years, many of them with Simone, by the way. So, and I'm sure that Simone is more than happy to do the same. So feel free to reach out. We can.
Fantastic.
We can,
Fantastic. So there's Gino's email. Feel free to reach out to him with your questions. He's there to answer them. Simone, the same thing. Here it's bays.city.ac.uk. And Simone's email, he's got two there. Feel free to reach out to him with your questions. If you're in Italy by chance, the 15th to the 16th of December, so coming right up, they're doing a conference in Matera.
Yeah.
So you would be, it's highly recommended that you go travel to Matera to see this conference and get to know exactly what they're talking about. So again, that's available at artinova.com. Or you can reach out again to Gino and Simone with your questions.
By the way, Matera is also an incredible place for food lovers. So I also encourage people to go to Matera to have wonderful food. And I apologize unfortunately, I'm struggling with some nasal congestion. I've been struggling for days, so I apologize if my voice was not always clear.
It's very, very clear, Gino. Nothing to apologize for. Thank you so very much to Professors Gino Cattani and Simone.
Our pleasure. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And again, thank you very much to Victoria and Frederick Mulligan for their support of this show, as well as Agnieszka and Benoit Rivole. Thanks very much to Mary Schlesinger for the lovely Viennese library you can see behind me. Most of all, thanks to you, our participants who make it all worthwhile, from London, England, and New London, New England, as well as Kyoto, Japan. Goodbye, and see you next Wednesday.
Thank you so much.